Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of GDC Showcase. I'm Brian Francis, a contributing editor at gamasutra.com and maker of things here at GDC. Today's super special guest for our Ask Me Anything session is Obsidian Entertainment's Carrie Patel. Carrie, would you please introduce yourself?
Hey, Bryant. Thanks a bunch for having me. It's really great to be talking to you today. My name is Carrie Patel, and as Bryant said, I work at Obsidian Entertainment, where I am a game director and a senior narrative designer. I joined the company in 2013 to write for Pillars of Eternity, wrote for the White March expansions. I was co-narrative lead on Pillars of Eternity to Deadfire. Then I went on to write for The Outer Worlds, and I directed our first expansion for that game, Paralon Gorgon, and I'm currently directing an upcoming title from Obsidian. So again, great to see everybody here today.
Awesome. I have played a lot of those games, and I have really enjoyed my time with them. But let's get the show on the road. You've got questions. She's got answers. I'm just the rando in the middle who can relay questions from A to B. Go ahead and start submitting your questions via the question tab in Swapcard's chat function. Are you tired of hearing the word question yet? You can ask questions about Carrie's work on The Outer Worlds, Pillars of Eternity, or just her work as a writer, narrative designer, and game director in general. Y'all have already put some good questions in chat. Let's do this. Okay, and that's the point where I scroll over and go grab the questions that I've been looking at. I really enjoyed this question, so I want to start with this one from Lake Watkins. Lake Watson says, "Hi, Carrie. Thanks for the AMA. They are curious what tools or techniques you use for player modeling in your games. Do you identify player psychographics or use some other approach?" I actually knew Obsidian has a decent model for this, so I wanted to throw this one up top because it was pretty sophisticated.
By which you mean like who we think the player is trying to play in the game?
I think like identifying different player types, like explorers, story nerds, combat nerds, like that's a very shorthand rough example I would use. But yeah, I think that's where the question's going.
Yeah, so for that, I think the first question is what kind of game are you making, and what are the fundamental design pillars of that game? And that is sort of the first filter for what kind of player base, what kind of player type you're really trying to serve. For a lot of the games, like we're mostly known for RPGs with a lot of story and a lot of reactivity and a lot of player freedom. So our model for a lot of those types of games is a lot of tabletop role-playing games. So, we look at the things that players seem to get the most out of that. Like they get a lot of character interaction. They get the sense of a really big reactive world to explore that gives them lots of options for how to solve problems, lots of tools that they can use, and again, a high degree of reactivity to how they use those tools. Meaningful and interesting characters to interact with, and so I think a lot of the player types, we assume, like, we know there are people who want to go fight things. We know there are players who want to explore and immerse themselves in a really deep, well-realized reactive world. And we know there are players who really care about story and character and companions, and they want to get to know everybody in the world, talk to everybody. So, knowing that those are, I think, kind of the three big content draws of our games, we try to set them up in such a way that players can approach that content in whatever way and with whatever focus we want.
Tremaine Williams. Tremaine, thank you so much for hanging out with the showcase. I've seen you in a bunch of chats. Just wanted to give you a shout out. Tremaine Williams wants to know, when building an open world game, how do you determine how big is too big? How do you deal with dead space between points of interest?
Oh, man. There are a lot of ways we can do this. It's, obviously an interesting environment for the player to traverse, combat encounters in between, banter with your companions, but sometimes a little bit of dead space is okay. Like if the player is always moving from one encounter to the next, from one bit of banter to the next, there's not really a moment to just sort of slow down and appreciate and also anticipate where you're headed. And I think this is where just like play testing and again understanding like what is the pace of the experience you're trying to offer is really important. Because again, you do want a little bit of quiet space. Like some of the most fun I've had in The Witcher 3 and in games like Breath of the Wild is just sort of getting from one point to the next and kind of having this goal in mind. If I see something in the distance, I want to get there, and I know it's going to take me a little bit of time to get there and I'll run into a few surprises, but because I am interested in this world and I don't know what I'm going to find next, the process of getting there is fun.
Right on. Our next question comes from Katie Setoff. Katie would like to know, as a narrative designer, do you ever run into trade-offs between storytelling and engineering limitations? If so, how do you balance those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think engineering limitations, I think that's an issue for just about every design department. And fundamentally, you always have to, I think you do have to start from the perspective of what is possible and what tool, like what are the tools I have, at my disposal, and what are the constraints that I have to abide by, rather than saying, let me just do what I want and make it someone else's problem to make it work.
Mhm.
So, I mean, again, this could be this can relate to how often or how many cutscenes you can use, sort of the graphical fidelity of conversations, um, and I mean, honestly, there are a lot of gameplay constraints as well that play into this. Like, are you playing a game where you can kill every NPC? Because if so, that's something that you have to adjust for in the way you tell stories and the alternate avenues you offer to players. Is this a game where we are going to automatically pull players into any conversation they encounter, or do we allow players to opt in? Again, in which case, you have to have to think about how those players are going to have a good experience, even if it's not necessarily the golden path experience that you are primarily designing around. So, I mean, I think yes, engineering limitations can be a bit of an issue, but I think the bigger thing to think about for narrative, and again for any design department, is just what is the level of freedom you're offering players. What sort of gameplay tools do we have as designers, and are we offering players, just to make sure that the experience that you're trying to set up actually plays well with the game that you're making.
Right on. Kirsty Logan Fowler is asking a question that I would consider one of the most loaded questions I hear from narrative folks, but we're going to go for it. What kind of structure do you use? Hero's journey, 3-act structure, 5-act structure, and does it differ between games and different types of games? I just heard a bunch of knives being unsheathed somewhere.
Yeah, I'm not really, I don't know. I'm not a huge believer in any one of those structures being like the right way to tell stories, the right way to tell game stories. Um, the way I look at tools like that is, if it is a useful framework for you to think in and for you to think about story and pacing and escalation and character arcs, then go ahead and use it. But I think that when you get into writing a story to fit a formula rather than using a framework to help you create and pace your story, I think you're putting the cart before the horse. We do tend to write a lot of our story overviews and our story briefs with 3-act structure. I've definitely done that, and I've seen a number of other people at Obsidian use 3 or even 5-act structure. But again, it's less about saying, oh, we have to follow this very rigid formula around our acts, and more just, let's think about the kind of the phases and the developments and the major beats that players are going to go through, and how that, what environment is the player in now, what are the big problems in front of them, kind of what are we trying to pull them towards at each of these different phases of the story. And again, with a more open world game, with something where you're offering players lots of freedom in what they do and how they explore, again, you have to keep in mind they may not follow the story beats the way you are intending them to. So again, you can't necessarily engineer the perfect 3-act structure for like every player who goes through Prim to get to New Vegas, and also every player who fights through the Death Claws on the other side to get there. But you do have to understand that players may choose that other experience, and they still expect to have a good time, even if they understand that they're, by choice, skipping out on some of the other content you've laid in front of them.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to roll 2 questions together. Noah Denny asks, how would you suggest a high school student to get a career in the video game industry? Connor McClaskey is also asking, what is the number one mistake you see beginners who want to get into a narrative design career make? Those are both kind of career starting questions. I figured I would throw them both in the pool at once so you could formulate the answer that you see covers that topic.
Yeah, I'd say for getting into the games industry, however you can, which isn't super helpful. And the thing is, we're such a young industry, and it is developing so quickly that, even though I joined a little more than 7 years ago, my experience was I applied to an online opening, interviewed, did a narrative test, and got the job. And that that is certainly not how many of my colleagues have gotten in. Many people have, gotten in through other studios where they garnered other experience, or if they wanted to get into narrative design or a different role, they maybe started in something else. QA is a common entry point for a lot of people, but you can honestly, like, if you can get into another design role, that's often one of the most narrative adjacent if you want to get some of that experience. So I think. Understand which of those roles you're targeting, but be open to adjacent roles that may still allow you to get more experience, and also allow you to show that you are a capable person who can learn and address challenges as they come at you, because it's obviously very important. As far as mistakes, I think one thing is just not honing writing fundamentals enough. I think fortunately, we're getting to a point where game narrative and narrative design is, becoming enough of an established discipline that you don't hear as much anymore. Like, oh, well, it's good enough for games. Like,
Oof.
no, we expect quality. And so, honestly, just basic sentence level, being able to write strong error-free dialogue that is mechanically correct, that conveys a sense of character, that implies things without over-explaining them, and also, honestly, that gives for an RPG in particular, that gives players sort of hooks to establish their own role and involvement around. Like, the least interesting conversations in a lot of RPGs are the ones where an NPC is telling you their very detailed backstory, and your options are basically, listen, go on, yes. The more interesting ones I think of, like improv, where as a player you're presented with a scenario or confrontation or a question of some kind, and you are interacting with this other NPC. And you're sort of expressing yourself as a character in this world through your interaction with them.
Gotcha. The when you brought up that example of the character reading backstory, and the only examples are tell me more. I thought of that My Dinner with Andre interactive game joke from The Simpsons from like the 90s or something, and how they beat Telltale to that format. Anyway, that's too niche a joke. Jung Shang Lin would like to know, in the Outer Worlds, is there any notable difference in terms of your approach to narrative design compared to Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2?
Yes. So, and some of this may be maybe fairly micro. I mean, one big thing is in the Pillars games, those were top-down isometric games where you were very zoomed out from the player, or from the characters on the screen. And so, that definitely limited what we could show happening on screen. But it also meant that we had a bit more freedom to use descriptive prose to describe someone's gesture, expression, describe kind of what they're doing within like a believable sort of bubble around them. With the Outer Worlds, obviously we want to, write dialogue and then use, gestures and facial animations to show those shifts in emotion and to show characters actually doing things in the world. Which, in some ways, and maybe this is also because, I come from a background writing novels and short stories, I did really miss that ability to write descriptive prose and to let that do some of the storytelling heavy lifting, and also just handle some of the emotional beats, of someone who is saying one thing but emoting another. Because that's obviously very hard to do, even with unless you're, performance capturing everything. So that was one big difference. And I think the other was just sort of the understanding, obviously, of who the player is and what sort of range of characterizations we're letting them embody in the world. Again, Pillars drawing a bit more from tabletop, we try to widen that range a bit, and we say, you are the watcher, and this is the context for which you have unique insight and abilities in this world, and why you can help people solve these problems that they have. But, again, trying to follow that tabletop formula, we have a variety of dispositions and a variety of, skills. And so we want to make sure that however you are sort of building yourself accordingly, that you feel you can express that character. For the Outer Worlds, we still wanted to take a pretty light touch in terms of assuming who the player character is. As an outsider, they don't actually have a role, like the Watcher, that gives them a a really, really unique skill set, except that they are an outsider to a world where they can sort of see the absurdity of it just because they
Hmm.
are not of it. Um, but yeah, our kind of one of the big models for who the player character is in that world was Mal Reynolds from Firefly. The idea of someone who's not a saint, not a villain, someone with sort of a morally gray spectrum who can, embody either end or, some range in between as the player wants to.
Hmm. Ellen Ducarpe asks one of my favorite questions in here, which is, as a narrative designer, how much say do you have in things like item and weapon descriptions or anything that could be considered systemic that adds to the narrative as a whole?
So at Obsidian, we do try to, and this is different at every studio.
Hmm.
And I should also say that at Obsidian, narrative designers and writers are the same role. Many
Hmm.
studios separate them out. We do not. We try to integrate narrative pretty early in our process because, again, it's really just about making sure that we have a world that feels cohesive and a story that feels reflective of the game the player is actually playing.
Hmm.
So narrative designers will tend to have a lot more authorial control over anything that is like a quest item or obviously a note or a readable in world. We aren't always quite as closely involved with things like weapon descriptions, especially the stuff that is a bit more systemic. that's
Hmm.
that's the kind of thing where it honestly just sort of depends on your staffing, where you might have your narrative designers do a pass on that stuff later, but because it is a bit less closely tied to quest content that the player is likely to be playing, it's not quite as necessary to have a really detailed writing pass on, this particular sword.
Hmm. I'm going to go to a question from Joshua Garcia Sheridan, who's kind of asking about Pavarti from the Outer Worlds. Their question is, what sort of pitch was presented for the inclusion of an asexual character in the Outer Worlds? Were there any arguments conducted in the course of that implementation? I know that writing belongs to a couple other writers on the team, but if there's anything you'd like to throw in about, like, Obsidian deciding to add an asexual character to the game, and also in the context of, for those who don't know, that this character does have a full romance arc, even though they're asexual, which is that seems totally obvious if you're familiar with asexuality, but I can see why that's not obvious at first blush.
Yeah, so Parvati was written by Chris Latoile and Kate Dollarhide, who did an incredible job with her. Also got a little bit of supporting writing from Nitai Padar.
Hmm.
She was concepted before I joined the Outer Worlds.
Hmm.
But I mean, I think where that character started is just wanting to give her a very authentic and sort of emotionally resonant experience, because Parvati's arc is about, she's from this small town and she gets out of Edgewater and gets to finally see the rest of the galaxy. And part of what makes her so interesting is that she's so kind and pure and good in a
Hmm.
world that is corrupt and cruel and nasty. And there's this, I certainly, when I first played those early builds, I was like, well, how is this character going to react, when she gets out there? And also, how do we make her feel like she is part of the same world, when she
Hmm.
is so clearly different from it? So, I think just giving her a story and a quest that related to her sort of embracing and accepting more of who she is, that
Hmm.
led her to an authentic and emotionally fulfilling relationship, again, even in a world that does not seem to place a lot of value on those.
Hmm.
I don't recall any specific discussion about, like, her as an asexual character. It's like oh, should we? No, it's like, this is who the character is and this is the story we're telling about her, and so we just want to tell it well.
Getting off topic from Outer Worlds characters, Stephen Marasala would like to know, how do you handle or deal with writer's block if you or anyone on the writing team has experienced it during development?
Well, so one thing, sometimes honestly, it helps just to move on to a different task or a different piece of content if you can. I know I have a tendency to try to, kind of bang my head against a wall trying to solve one problem,
Hmm.
when sometimes the best thing to do is just step back from it and let those details marinate in the back of your mind as you're doing something else. Another technique I like to use, especially if I really do need to get some quest or character writing done, is even if I'm having writer's block around, who that character is, what makes the conversation with the player character interesting and engaging, I generally at least know how and where the conversation begins and where we need to get the player by the end of it. And so sometimes I like to do something that I think of as a rough pass, which is it's not purely placeholder text, as in, Sanjar says this, or Sanjar tells player to go here. It's it's just sort of, it's something between that and, an actual invoice writing pass. And it's just, it's what other writers I think talk about when they say turning off your inner editor, where it's like, this doesn't have to be good, this doesn't have to be final, this just has to let me explore a way to get from A to B, without worrying that I'm setting anything in stone, and without worrying that this is what people are going to review in another week. And sometimes honestly just getting that structure out there lets me return to it later and then see, oh well, here's some clear beats and arcs and moments that are happening even in this roughed out version that I can build on and have fun with. Or, oh, okay, well, now that the work of sort of structuring this out at a high level is done, now I feel like I have a bit more room to think and play with what makes it fun.
Gotcha. Philip Anichek would like to know, when a concept of a game is created at the very beginning, before, or during pre-production, what questions do you usually need answered to establish the pillars or main points for the core game idea?
I guess it's, what kind of, I guess the biggest question is, what is the experience that you want players to have? Like, what is your elevator pitch of, this is why you're going to play the game, and this is the promise of what we're offering with it. I feel like you start with the very focused, well, the very high level stuff, and you sort of build out as you go down. So you have that experience, and then you say, okay, well, there are basic things like, okay, well, what platforms are we offering this on? What's kind of the genre? Is this an RPG? Is this an action? Is this somewhere in between? What kind of setting is this? Is this sci-fi? Is this fantasy? Is this an existing IP? And kind of as you build out those questions, you're also thinking about, I think the pillars are one of the things that should come very early in the process, because your pillars are the design goals and elements that support that basic experience. And you may sort of massage how you frame them, how you word them, and as you're sort of building out the specifications of the game, you may need to take a couple checkpoints and say, like, okay, are these specifications, are these different features that we want to invest in, is this still reflective of the core experience and the pillars that we are saying support that core experience? That answer the question?
You'd have to ask them. Unfortunately, they aren't in the call with us, so we're gonna move on. Anyway, we've only got about a little over 5 minutes left, folks. So I just wanted to let you know we're gonna get a couple more questions in. We're going to burn through as many as we can. Before we go, I also want to remind you that you should stick around. There's so much more great free sessions coming your way. I'm super excited. The GDC podcast is going to be recording live later on, and they're going to be recording with Derek Yu, creator of Spelunky and Spelunky 2. So, Carrie, before we go, if they've got more questions for you, where should they send them? Where can they find you, or Obsidian in general?
Sure.
Not literally, but on the internet.
Right. You can find me on Twitter at Carrie_Patel. And you can also find Obsidian on Twitter at Obsidian.
At Obsidian. Gotcha. Okay. Questions until the end. What would you say is unique for the medium when it comes to writing as opposed to traditional prose fiction? I love that question because you mentioned you've done prose writing as well. That comes from Peter Varga.
So I think, and again, this sort of varies depending on, my game experience has been on RPGs, and on RPGs specifically that offer the player a pretty wide latitude in who they are in the world. So with that in mind, I think the biggest difference is just understanding who the protagonist is. In a novel or any other piece of prose fiction, obviously you have a very carefully choreographed arc that you're sending that main character on. You know the beats they're going to hit, you know how they're going to react to them, and you were telling a story around that. When you are writing an RPG like Pillars of Eternity or like The Outer Worlds, you have beats that you know the player is going to hit, but you want to offer the player some room in expressing how they feel about those beats and how they want to react to them. And so there's it's actually pretty exciting. Like it's a lot of fun to look at a particular moment and think, well, this is how I feel about it, but how might someone else feel about it? And what touch points and what thematic reflections can we offer elsewhere in the game to just sort of prepare the player for this moment and give them a new context in which to think about it.
Gotcha. I love this question from Zayad El Badrawi. I'm going to tweak it slightly, but Zayad, I just want to say I really like it. Zayad wants to know, how do you go about constructing a narrative? Do you start with an idea, a question, a theme, etc., or is there a different process you go through? For me, a big part of that question, I guess, is like, what inspires you as a writer? Like, what gets you like energized, and where do those good ideas and good story moments come from for you?
Gosh, man, they can come from a lot of things. Like I do think it's important, as a writer, honestly, as a designer of any kind in games, as a creator in any kind of media, to consume widely. Don't just play games, also read books and watch movies, and don't just play the genre you make. Like, try other things as well. I do think it's important to kind of get outside of a very narrow lane and draw inspiration from and experience kind of the variety and the options that other media and other genres offer you. I get inspired by great characters and by really evocative settings. And so, for me, finding works of fiction that offer me those things kind of, keeps me creatively engaged.
Gotcha. We're going to close out with our last question for the day, coming from Kirsty Logan Fowler. Kind of going to springboard off of our discussion about Pavarti from earlier. Kirsty Logan Fowler is asking, how do you approach diversity and representation in your writing?
Trying to be as inclusive as we can about, who the player is, who the player might be, and the world that, that we're setting our story in. I think, be inclusive. And also, I think, obviously, getting outside of tropes, getting outside of stereotypes. I think just being very mindful about what your first impulse is, and then asking, well, why is it this? It's, if your first thought is, well, the knight character is obviously this guy, who looks like this. It's like, well, but why? It's not that we can't have that character in there. It's not that he can't be a knight, but it's just, is that popping into my head is that the first thing popping into my head because there's some real meat there? Or is it just because that's the first place my brain went because it's a thing I've seen a dozen times? And what I'm really doing is just sort of riffing off of a very, commonly seen trope and example. So again, I think be mindful, dig deeper, be compassionate with the characters you write and the stories you tell. It doesn't mean everybody has to have everybody has to have a happy ending, but it does mean that we treat our characters and their stories with respect and gravity and emotional nuance.
Roger that. We're going to do a rapid exit, but that's it for today. Thank you all so much for joining us. Stick around. There's more great stuff. Carrie, thank you. Can't wait to see what's next for you in Obsidian.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.